This is my true story. I spent my life working to raise a son I thought would honor my name. Every meal, every late night, every dollar saved, it was all for him. I never thought the same hands I fed would turn against me. One afternoon, my son spat in my tea and told me to drink it. I looked at the cup, and for the first time, I saw the truth. I had raised arrogance, not gratitude. But what I did next changed everything. Before I continue, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so my story can reach more people. I spent most of my life believing that kindness always came back. When my wife passed away, my only purpose became raising my son into a man she would have been proud of. I worked long nights, my back bent, and my hands blistered so he would never go hungry. Every dream he had became mine. When he said he wanted to study business, I sold my late wife's jewelry to pay for his tuition. When he wanted to open his own office, I took a loan under my name so he could start without worry. Every sacrifice I made felt like love in motion, a way to keep her memory alive through him. I gave him everything I never had: education, security, freedom. I taught him that money meant nothing if it wasn't earned with respect. I believed he would understand. In my mind, love and loyalty were the same. You gave both without expecting them back. So when he started doing well, I smiled with pride, not realizing pride was all I would have left. When the business began to grow, he insisted I step back, said he wanted me to rest. I thought it was kindness. I thought my boy had become the man I had raised him to be. I didn't know that rest meant move aside. He took the lead at the company, and I gladly handed over the papers, believing it was time for him to lead. I had faith in him, blind, deep, and unshakable. The first few years were good. He called often, asked for advice, even visited with small gifts on weekends. We shared tea every Sunday afternoon, sitting on the porch, talking about business, family, and her, the woman we both missed. Those moments felt like peace. But peace can turn to illusion without you noticing. Slowly, things began to change. He started arriving late, answering me less. He spoke more about profits and less about people. He stopped calling me dad and started saying old man with a smirk. I brushed it off as stress, told myself success could make anyone impatient. Still, I stayed patient, telling my heart that love always wins back the lost. One day, he told me I should let go of the past and stop talking about how the business started. I didn't understand at first. Later, I realized he didn't want to remember that the foundation he stood on was built with my hands. He wanted credit without history, and history, I was the living proof of it. When I visited the office, some of the employees, once respectful and warm, looked uneasy. They'd stand when I entered, but their eyes shifted nervously toward his door. I could tell he'd warned them not to treat me like the founder anymore. I'd built that office, every wall, every inch of it, yet I had become a ghost walking through its halls. At home, he began speaking to me like I was a child. He would laugh when I forgot something small. He'd call me slow, outdated, even useless. Each word cut deeper than the last. Still, I stayed quiet. I thought silence was the last way I could love him, by not answering cruelty with anger. I kept making him tea, kept sitting at the same table, kept believing one day he'd remember who I was. When his business grew larger, so did his arrogance. He bought expensive suits, threw grand parties, but forgot the man who gave him the first loan. He never invited me anymore. I watched his name appear in newspapers and his photo in magazines while I sat at home, proud but aching. Pride is a strange thing. It shines in public and cries in private. One afternoon, he brought some guests to the house. I prepared tea for them, just like old times. They laughed loudly in the living room, talking about success and numbers. I carried the tray with shaking hands, smiling despite the ache in my chest. He didn't even look at me when I placed his cup down. That was the day I realized something important. Respect cannot be inherited. It must be earned, and it can be lost. Still, I kept my faith. I believed that beneath the pride, somewhere deep down, my son was still the boy who used to hug me after every little success. The boy who once said, "Dad, I want to make you proud." But faith, when misplaced, becomes pain in disguise, and soon I would learn just how far a heart could be pushed before it stops forgiving. Time has a strange way of showing you who people really are. The son I had once held with trembling hands was no longer the same man standing before me. Success had changed his voice, his eyes, his patience. It began with small things, a sigh when I asked a question, a frown when I shared advice, a quick glance at his watch while I spoke. Those moments that once felt like father and son now felt like boss and burden. At first, I thought he was just tired. I told myself that maybe his days were longer, that pressure made him short-tempered. So I excused every disrespect, every missed phone call, every forgotten dinner, every unanswered, "How are you?" I made peace with it, thinking love could survive even when ignored. I didn't realize I was slowly training my heart to accept neglect as normal. He began correcting me at the table, cutting my sentences short. When I spoke to guests, he'd smirk if I stumbled over a word. Once, when an employee called me "sir," he laughed and said, "He's retired, don't worry about him." I smiled then, but something cracked inside. Retirement wasn't the issue, erasure was. My son started managing the company like I'd never existed. He changed the logo, the policies, even the people. The few who stayed loyal to me were slowly pushed out. He said it was modernization. I called it rewriting history. My name disappeared from the documents, from the front desk, from the website. But what hurt most wasn't the missing name. It was that he didn't even think I'd notice. At home, his tone hardened. He was always on the phone, shouting orders, boasting about deals. The humility that once made him special had turned into arrogance that made him unrecognizable. He'd walk past me without greeting, too busy, too powerful, too different. Sometimes, when I tried to start a conversation, he'd just say, "I've got no time for this." No time for the man who gave him all his time. I remember one Sunday vividly. I had prepared lunch, his favorite meal from childhood. When he arrived, he barely looked at the table. He ordered takeout instead, saying he couldn't eat old people food. The sting of those words stayed long after the food went cold. I sat there quietly, pretending not to care, but my hands shook as I cleared the plates. I realized then that I was becoming invisible in my own home. He no longer asked for my opinion on business. When I tried to give advice, he'd roll his eyes and say, "That's not how things work anymore." I used to be his guide. Now I was just a background noise he wanted to mute. Sometimes he even mocked the way I dressed or the way I walked, saying I was stuck in the past. But the past he mocked was the reason he had a future. The worst part wasn't the disrespect, it was the pride in it. There was a cold satisfaction in his tone, as if hurting me made him feel powerful. He had forgotten that success without gratitude is failure in disguise. I had built everything for him, but I hadn't built him strong enough to carry humility. He began hosting parties at home, full of laughter that didn't belong to family. I'd hear strangers speaking loudly, glasses clinking, music thumping through the walls. I stayed in my room, pretending not to exist. Once, I walked out to greet them, thinking maybe my presence would remind him of his roots. He looked at me and said, "Dad, can you go back to your room?" "This isn't your scene," I went back, but not because he asked. I went because I realized I no longer belonged in the house I'd built. Days became longer. Even the walls seemed colder. My health started to fade. Not from illness, but from sorrow. I wasn't dying physically. I was disappearing emotionally. The laughter outside my door was proof that life had moved on without me. But deep down, a small ember still burned. The belief that he might wake up one day and see me again, not as a burden, but as his father. But arrogance rarely wakes before destruction. And soon, his cruelty would cross the one line even love couldn't defend. I had endured the sighs, the mockery, the silence. But what happened next would turn my heartbreak into resolve. It was a quiet afternoon when everything changed, the kind of day that feels ordinary until it rewrites your entire life. The sun filtered weakly through the curtains, and the air smelled faintly of dust and old memories. I had been sitting in the living room, mending an old jacket he once wore as a boy. The television murmured softly in the background, and for a moment it almost felt peaceful. But peace is fragile when it lives beside pride. My son came home from work earlier than usual. His shoes clicked sharply against the tiled floor, each step filled with impatience. I looked up, smiling faintly, hoping he might join me for tea. He didn't even look in my direction. He went straight to the kitchen, tossing his coat on the counter, muttering about something under his breath. I followed slowly, asking if he wanted a cup of tea. That small question was enough to ignite the storm. He turned sharply, eyes cold and voice sharp. "You're old and useless," he shouted. "Stop getting in my way." For a moment I thought I hadn't heard him right. The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. Useless. That word echoed louder than any sound I'd ever heard. My mind went blank. My hands trembled, and the cup I was holding slipped from my grasp, shattering on the floor. He didn't flinch. He just sighed, grabbed his phone, and walked away, as if my heartbreak was nothing more than a noise in the background. I stood there, staring at the broken pieces of the cup. The tea spread slowly across the floor, dark and warm, like the years I had poured into raising him. Every drop reminded me of something. The long nights I stayed up helping him study, the mornings I went without breakfast so he could eat, the decades of silence I endured just to keep peace. And all of it ended with two words: old and useless. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every sacrifice I had ever made. I remembered his first school uniform, how he had cried on his first day, and how I promised him I'd always be there. I remembered his first car, how I'd worked extra hours to afford it. Every moment was a seed of love, watered with patience. But now I realized that some seeds grow into thorns. When the sun rose, I sat by the window, feeling the quiet creep into my bones. I didn't feel anger, just a strange stillness. It was the calm that comes after you've lost something you can never get back. My heart didn't ache because he had insulted me. It ached because I had lost the illusion that he loved me the way I loved him. Later that morning, he left for work as if nothing had happened. He didn't apologize. He didn't even look at me. That was when I realized the truth. Some people don't just forget what you've done for them. They erase it completely. They rewrite history to make themselves heroes, and you a relic of the past. I walked into his room after he left. Everything there was spotless and modern, the kind of life I had dreamed for him. But standing there, surrounded by the things my sacrifices had built, I felt like a stranger. On his desk was a framed photo of him shaking hands with a business partner. My photo, once beside it, was gone. That empty space on the table told me everything I needed to know. That was the day I stopped being a father in my heart and became a man again. A man with a choice. I realized that love without respect is not love at all. It's servitude. And I had served long enough. I walked back to my room and opened the old wooden drawer that had been sealed for years. Inside were the property papers, the deed to the very house he was standing in. The same roof he had just insulted me under. My name was still printed clearly on every page. He had forgotten that the home he claimed was his was still mine. As I held those papers in my hands, something shifted inside me. I felt no rage, only clarity. The years of endurance had ended. I didn't plan revenge. I planned release. I would take back everything I had built, not to punish him, but to free myself from the prison of his pride. That night, I called my lawyer. I didn't tell him much, just that I needed to meet in the morning. He recognized the weariness in my voice and agreed immediately. When I hung up, I made myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and watched the streetlights flicker. The tea was bitter, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I drank it slowly and felt peace, not humiliation. The next day would begin the quiet storm that would change everything. A storm that would not destroy with noise, but with signatures and silence. That night stretched longer than any I had lived before. It felt as if time itself had slowed down just to make me sit with every memory I had tried to forget. The house was quiet, but it wasn't peace. It was the silence of something that had already died inside. I sat in my chair, staring at the dim lamp in the corner, feeling like the light was flickering with me. Every creak of the wood, every whisper of the wind outside, reminded me that this home had once been alive, filled with laughter, warmth, and love. Now it was nothing more than walls holding echoes of betrayal. I replayed every chapter of my life with my son. The day he was born, I could still remember the trembling joy when I held him for the first time. The day he took his first step, the pride in his eyes when I clapped for him. The times we sat together fixing broken radios, eating leftovers while laughing about small things. I remembered him holding my hand at his mother's grave, promising he would take care of me always. That boy, that small, loving boy, was gone, and I didn't know when I had lost him. The words, "You're old and useless," repeated in my head like a curse that wouldn't fade. I tried to forgive, but forgiveness is hard when respect is buried under arrogance. My hands trembled as I reached for an old photo album from the drawer. Each picture was a reminder that I had once mattered, not for what I owned, but for who I was. Now, the same son who once hugged me with love had spat those words like poison. It wasn't just an insult, it was a declaration that I no longer belonged in the world I helped build. The more I thought, the heavier the air became. I walked to his room, stood at the door, and looked inside. His bed, his clothes, his expensive gadgets, all of it bought by the man he now saw as useless. I smiled sadly. Everything he called his started with me. The furniture, the business, the house. My sweat had written its story into every brick. Yet, to him, I had become invisible. That thought hurt more than any slap ever could. The clock ticked slowly toward midnight, and my heart felt both heavy and strangely calm. That calm wasn't peace. It was realization. I realized I had been living for a man who stopped seeing me years ago. I had fed pride instead of gratitude, and now I was the one starving for respect. There comes a moment in every parent's life when you stop trying to be needed and start choosing to be free. That was my moment. I sat down at the table with an old notebook and pen. My hand shook, but I wrote down everything I remembered. Every date, every debt I had cleared, every favor I had done, every sacrifice that had gone unnoticed. It wasn't for revenge. It was a way to remind myself that my life had meaning, even if my son couldn't see it. I wasn't useless. I had built something from nothing, and I still could build again, this time for myself. I opened the drawer and took out the deed of the house once more. The papers were yellowing at the edges, but my name was still bold. My house. My life. My peace. He had forgotten, but the law hadn't. I ran my fingers over the signature, remembering how proud I had been when I first bought this home. Back then, it symbolized family. Now, it would become my freedom. The night outside deepened, but I didn't feel tired. My mind was sharper than it had been in years. I thought of my lawyer, a man who had handled my affairs quietly and loyally. He would understand. I decided then that the next sunrise would bring change. No shouting, no confrontation, just the quiet power of a pen, the only weapon I had ever needed. Before going to bed, I made myself another cup of tea. The steam rose gently, catching the lamplight like a memory trying to stay alive. I sat there staring at it, remembering the day he had spat in my cup. That humiliation had killed the last piece of me that wanted his approval. Now this tea was mine, clean, bitter, and honest. I sipped slowly, letting it burn through my throat, feeling it cleanse me from the inside. That night, I made a silent promise. I would not cry again. I would not beg again. I would not sit at his table waiting for kindness. The next time I held a piece of paper, it wouldn't be to sign another loan or to help him grow. It would be to close the book he had written me out of. As the clock struck 3, I turned off the light and whispered to the darkness, "Tomorrow begins my peace." The house stayed quiet, but for the first time the silence felt like it belonged to me. The morning came without music, no birds, no breeze, just stillness, as if the world itself was waiting for what I was about to do. I rose early, dressed neatly, and looked at myself in the mirror. The man staring back wasn't weak anymore. His eyes were tired, yes, but there was something sharp in them. Purpose. For years, I had been quiet, patient, forgiving. That morning, I became something else, deliberate. I walked to my desk and laid out every document I had kept locked away for decades: property papers, business records, bank account ledgers. The sound of each folder opening was like the sound of chains breaking. My hands moved slowly, carefully, like I was touching history. Every signature on those papers carried my name, my sweat, my years, my worth. My son had forgotten that everything he stood on was built by me. Today he would remember. I started with the business. It was once our pride, a small company that I had built from scratch. When I handed him the management years ago, I thought I was giving him a future. Instead, I had handed him a weapon he used against me. He changed the logo, replaced the old workers, erased the name that started it all, my name. I had stayed silent because I thought family mattered more than pride. But now I realized silence had cost me both. I opened the financial statements. He had been reckless, borrowing in my company's name, spending money like air. I highlighted each transfer he made without my consent, each misuse of funds that could be legally challenged. The more I read, the clearer it became that my revenge didn't need anger. It only needed truth. The law was already on my side. He had given me the weapon himself. By mid-morning, I called my lawyer, the same man who had helped me buy my first piece of land 50 years ago. He recognized my voice immediately, calm and respectful. I told him I wanted to meet privately and that I had important changes to make. He didn't ask why. He just said, "Come by noon." There was something comforting about that. No judgment, no pity, just quiet understanding. I placed all the documents into a brown folder, the same one I once used to keep my son's report cards. Funny how the same folder that once carried a boy's dreams would now carry his reckoning. I closed it, tied the string, and slipped it into my bag. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. Before leaving, I looked around the house. The walls I'd painted with my own hands, the kitchen where my late wife used to hum as she cooked, the living room where we celebrated birthdays and graduations. All of it had been built on love, and now it would become my final lesson. I didn't feel sorrow, only calm. The kind of calm that comes when you finally stop expecting kindness from cruelty. When I arrived at the lawyer's office, he greeted me warmly. We sat across from each other as I laid the papers on his desk. I explained everything: my son's behavior, the insult, the years of disregard, and finally, the betrayal. His face didn't show shock, only quiet disapproval. Not for me, but for what my son had become. We worked for hours. I transferred ownership of all assets out of my son's reach. The house, the cars, the business, all of it went into my name alone. I authorized a freeze on the accounts, revoked his access, and filed to dissolve his role in the company. Then came the final part: the legal case for elder financial abuse. My lawyer explained that the evidence I had provided was more than enough. The case would stand strong. When the last document was signed, he slid the papers toward me for review. I read them carefully, every line, every clause, ensuring no loophole remained. My hand shook slightly when I picked up the pen, not from age, but from realization. For decades, my signature had built my son's world. Today, that same signature would unbuild it. When I left the office, the air outside felt fresher. The sunlight hit my face, and for the first time, I didn't feel burdened by it. I walked home slowly, each step measured and deliberate. My neighbors greeted me, unaware of the quiet war I had just won. I smiled politely, holding the bag close. Inside it were the papers that would change everything, not through violence, but through justice. That evening, I sat in the living room again, the same place he had once shouted at me. The silence felt different now, powerful, not painful. I brewed myself a cup of tea and drank it slowly. The taste was sharp but pure. It was no longer a drink, it was a statement. A promise that I would never again be humiliated in my own home. In that moment, I realized revenge wasn't about anger. It was about dignity. It was about reclaiming the voice that years of love and guilt had buried. Tomorrow, he would still wake up thinking the world belonged to him, but by nightfall, he would learn that respect, once lost, is the most expensive thing to buy back. The stage was set. The papers were signed. The storm was ready. All that was left now was the silence before it began to rain. The days that followed were quiet, almost unnaturally so. My son still strutted around the house as if nothing had changed, as if his empire stood strong beneath his feet. He didn't know that every step he took was on ground that no longer belonged to him. His laughter filled the halls. His arrogance echoed off the walls I had built. But behind that laughter, I could already hear the faint crumble of everything he had taken for granted. He still barked orders over the phone, shouting at employees I had once trained with care. I listened from the living room, pretending to read the newspaper. Every time he raised his voice, I saw the same boy who used to hide behind me when thunder struck. That memory used to soften me. Now it only reminded me how far he had drifted from humility. I watched him and thought, a man who cannot respect his roots doesn't deserve the soil that raised him. He no longer noticed me. Days passed where we barely exchanged words. He came and went as though the house were his alone. Sometimes I'd catch him boasting on calls about his company, his assets, his life. He never once realized those words were lies now, hollow and borrowed. The bank accounts had been frozen, the property title changed, and his name quietly erased from every legal document that once made him powerful. I didn't tell him a word. That was the beauty of silence. It hides thunder behind stillness. I still made my tea every morning, still took my walks, still kept to my chair by the window. But there was a difference in my silence this time. It wasn't submission anymore. It was strategy. He mistook my quietness for weakness. What he didn't know was that patience, in the hands of the hurt, becomes the sharpest weapon of all. At night, I heard him laughing in his room, music playing loud, bottles clinking. The sound used to irritate me. Now, I only smiled. Let him celebrate, I thought. Every king dances hardest before his crown falls. Each morning, I received quiet updates from my lawyer. Papers processed, documents finalized, transfers sealed. Every message was a heartbeat of justice, slow and steady. By the end of the week, the last step would be complete. The official court order, stamped and irreversible. He had no idea what was coming. He was still spending money that no longer existed, driving a car that was technically mine, talking to people who no longer respected him but still feared his name. I could have told him. I could have warned him. But mercy is not always kindness. Sometimes it's cruelty delayed. One evening, he called me old man again, tossing his shoes in the corner as he passed. He didn't even look at me. I watched him go upstairs and thought of the first time I carried him on my shoulders, showing him how to climb trees. Back then, he had looked down at the world with wonder. Now, he looked down at people with contempt. That night, I couldn't sleep. I went out to the porch and sat under the faint light. The wind was cold, carrying the smell of rain. It was the kind of night that feels like a pause between two chapters. I thought about everything I had done. Every signature, every paper, every decision. I had built my life around one belief, that family comes before pride. But now, I understood something deeper. Dignity comes before both. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns quickly. What I felt was colder, steadier. It was the satisfaction of knowing that truth was already moving, silent but unstoppable. The court papers would be delivered soon, and he would see them not as punishment, but as reflection, a mirror showing him who he had become. When I went back inside, I saw his shoes by the door again, expensive, polished, careless. I bent down, straightened them, and placed them neatly side by side. It wasn't love, it was habit, the final trace of fatherhood leaving my body. Then I walked into my room, locked the drawer where I'd kept the last copy of the documents, and placed the key in my pocket. The silence felt almost sacred. My tea was still warm on the table, untouched. I lifted it slowly and took one long sip. The bitterness didn't bother me. I had learned to swallow worse things. The storm was ready. All that was left was one morning, one letter, one truth that would fall on him like rain after years of drought. He thought my silence meant defeat. He was wrong. My silence was simply waiting for the sound of his fall. The morning of the reckoning arrived quietly. The sky was overcast, and the light came through my window in soft streaks. I woke earlier than usual, calm and steady, as if my body already knew it was the day justice would speak. There was no anger left in me, only clarity. I made myself a cup of tea, the same way I had done every morning for decades, but today it tasted different, stronger, cleaner. The air carried a strange peace. I sat in the living room, listening to the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Each second felt like a countdown to something inevitable. My son was upstairs, still asleep, probably dreaming of power and control. He didn't know that while he slept, his empire had already fallen. The papers were sealed, the law had spoken, and the justice he thought would never reach him was already at the door. At 8:30, the doorbell rang. I didn't move immediately. I wanted to remember this moment exactly as it was. The sound wasn't loud. It was simple, almost polite. The kind of sound that announces change without noise. When I opened the door, a man in a gray suit stood there, a court official, holding a white envelope with my lawyer's seal. He greeted me respectfully, asked for my son's name, and handed the document over. "Serve it at breakfast," I told him quietly, and the man nodded before leaving. I placed the envelope on the dining table beside my son's usual seat. It sat there like a ghost of everything that had once been warm in this house. Family, respect, love. Now, it held none of those things. It held only truth, written in cold, perfect legal language. When my son came downstairs, the smell of breakfast was already in the air. I had prepared tea, eggs, and toast, a routine that hadn't changed even after all the hurt. He glanced at me briefly, then at the envelope on the table. "What's this?" he muttered, sitting down carelessly. I didn't answer. I poured myself tea, my hand steady. I looked at the steam rising from the cup, and for a moment it reminded me of the day he had spat into it, the day everything ended. That memory didn't sting anymore. It just reminded me how necessary today was. He tore the envelope open, the sound sharp and final. His eyes skimmed the pages, his lips moving as he read line after line. Then his expression began to change. Confusion first, then disbelief, then fear. The court's order was simple but powerful. All his access revoked, his authority nullified, his control over the business suspended pending investigation. Attached were documents proving his misuse of company funds, mismanagement, and legal evidence of elder abuse. Every transaction he thought was invisible had been laid bare. He looked up, face pale, eyes wide. I still said nothing. I took another sip of tea. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, each paragraph a hammer to the walls of arrogance he had built around himself. The house he bragged about wasn't his anymore. The accounts he flaunted were frozen. Even the car parked in the driveway had a new name on its title, mine. He spoke my name once, but it came out like a whisper, not a word. There was no more authority in it, no anger, no command, just shock. I stood slowly, set my teacup down, and looked at him. Really looked. For the first time in years he seemed small again, not because of his age, but because he finally stood without the armor of pride. He had nothing to protect him from the truth anymore. The silence between us was long and heavy, but I didn't need to fill it. The papers did all the talking. They carried every unsaid word, every quiet humiliation, every moment I had swallowed my pain in the name of love. I picked up my walking stick and moved toward the door. I didn't look back. Behind me, I heard him muttering, his voice cracking under disbelief. But I kept walking. I had already spent a lifetime giving him my attention. Now, my peace was worth more than his understanding. When I stepped outside, the air felt lighter. The clouds above were starting to break, small rays of sunlight slipping through. I took a deep breath and realized something. Revenge didn't always roar. Sometimes it arrived in silence, wrapped in an envelope, stamped by law. I walked down the path to the gate, passing the garden my wife once loved. The flowers were in bloom. I hadn't noticed that in years. Maybe because I had been too busy trying to fix someone who didn't want to be fixed. That morning, as I reached the end of the street, I felt something unshakable settle in me. Not triumph, but peace. I hadn't destroyed him. I had freed myself. The papers he held weren't punishment. They were closure. The man who once spat in my tea would now taste something far stronger. Consequence. The house was silent after I left. That silence wasn't peace. It was consequence. My son, once loud and commanding, now sat surrounded by papers that stripped him of everything he'd used to measure his worth. Money, property, authority, gone in a single morning. The arrogance that had filled his chest deflated like a balloon with a slow leak. For the first time in his life, he couldn't shout his way out of a problem. While I walked down the quiet lane, he sat in the ruins of his pride. Neighbors who had once smiled at him now whispered through curtains. The same people who had praised him for being successful were the first to share the news. Word travels faster than apology ever does. Within hours, everyone knew. The company was under investigation, the accounts frozen, and the house legally transferred. He wasn't the powerful man they once admired. He was a warning. By the next day, my lawyer informed me that the company board had officially removed him from management. There were too many irregularities under his leadership, too many personal luxuries masked as business expenses. His reputation, once his greatest shield, now turned into his downfall. Every lie he had built his image on began to unravel, one public document at a time. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. There was nothing joyful about justice. It simply balanced the scales. The world didn't need to see me as the victor. I just wanted to stop being the victim. For the next week, I received letters from banks and agencies confirming the transfers. The house was officially mine again, though I had no intention of staying there. Too many ghosts lingered in those rooms. Echoes of laughter turned to cruelty. Warmth turned to mockery. Every corner of that home reminded me of the man my son used to be before pride replaced love. He tried calling. The phone rang for hours, but I never answered. Sometimes I'd pick it up halfway, just to listen to the sound of his breathing, heavy, broken, desperate. Once upon a time, that sound would have made me rush to comfort him. Now it reminded me that regret is the echo of choices made too late. Eventually, the calls stopped. Silence took over again, but this time it was the right kind of silence. Not forced, not painful. It was the sound of closure. My lawyer told me he had visited the company one last time to gather his belongings. The employees avoided his eyes. Some out of pity, others out of quiet satisfaction. You could tell they'd all seen the way he treated people, how he barked, how he belittled, how he believed his last name made him untouchable. Now, that same name only brought whispers. In his pride, he had always believed respect came from power. He never understood that power without kindness is a house without a foundation, and when that house collapses, it takes everything with it. As for me, I spent those days packing. Just a few clothes, some papers, and a photograph of my late wife, smiling, calm, eternal. She had always warned me that love without respect will one day ask for payment. I finally understood what she meant. Before leaving, I took one last walk through the empty rooms. The furniture looked the same, but everything felt hollow. The chairs that once held family dinners now held memories of silence. The walls that once heard laughter now carried echoes of shouting. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a monument to lessons learned too late. I locked the door, not out of anger, but out of completion. The past was behind it. The future waited beyond the gate. The newspapers would later call it a family dispute turned legal storm. They didn't know the truth. It wasn't about money. It was about respect. I didn't leave with bitterness. I left with balance. I had given him everything, from the shoes on his feet to the roof over his head. In return, he gave me humiliation. And now, I had given him something he never expected from me: consequence. As I walked away from the house for the last time, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The man who spat in my tea had finally tasted humility, not because I forced it, but because the truth did what I never could. He would survive. He would learn. Maybe one day he would understand, but I wouldn't be there to see it. My chapter in his story was over, and for the first time in years, I finally felt free. The day after the court order was served, the house felt eerily quiet. No music, no shouting, no footsteps pacing through the hallway. Just silence. Clean, absolute silence. For years, I had prayed for peace, and now it had finally arrived, though not in the way I had imagined. I woke early, brewed my tea, and sat in the same chair where he had once humiliated me. The cup trembled slightly in my hand, not from age, but from the strange calm that follows a storm. By mid-morning, the lawyer called to confirm that all transitions had been executed. The company board had already voted to remove my son from his position. His name had been stripped from every document, account, and contract. The legal process that once seemed distant and slow had moved like lightning when truth was its fuel. I thanked the lawyer, hung up, and looked around the room, this time with relief. Justice had taken its seat at my table. I thought about how the son I raised, the one I fed, clothed, and defended, had turned into the man who spat on me without hesitation. I had spent years wondering where I went wrong, what I could have done differently. But now I understood something bitter and freeing. Sometimes love blinds us to the monster growing in our own home. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small moments. A raised tone, a missed thank you, a look of contempt. Those small cracks become walls before we realize we're trapped behind them. By noon, the news had already spread among our relatives and old business friends. Some called in shock, others in quiet approval. They all said the same thing: you did the right thing. I didn't need their validation, but I appreciated it. What I had done wasn't about revenge. It was about self-respect, the kind that doesn't come from pride, but from reclaiming what cruelty had stolen. Outside, life went on. I watched children play across the street, their laughter carried by the wind. It reminded me of when my son was that age, innocent, curious, endlessly asking questions about the world. I had worked double shifts to afford his schooling. I'd skipped meals to buy his books. I'd given him my best years so he could have a better life. But somewhere along the way, he learned to take, not to give. When evening came, I saw his car parked outside. He had come back, maybe to beg, maybe to shout, maybe to understand. I didn't move from my chair. He walked in without knocking, eyes red, shoulders heavy, his arrogance replaced by exhaustion. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. He looked around the house as if seeing it for the first time. The emptiness, the silence, the missing sense of ownership. It all struck him at once. He dropped a few papers on the table. Appeals, perhaps, or pleas. I didn't open them. He started to speak, his voice shaking, but I raised my hand lightly. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was something I had already buried. I simply told him, in calm, steady words, that respect cannot be reclaimed with excuses, that forgiveness means nothing without humility. He lowered his gaze and nodded slightly, tears forming but never falling. Then he turned and walked out again, this time slower, quieter, smaller. That night, I went to bed early. I slept peacefully for the first time in years. No nightmares, no regrets. The court case had taken more than his possessions. It had stripped away the illusion that family love could survive without mutual respect. It was a painful truth, but a necessary one. In the following weeks, I began putting my affairs in order, sold what I didn't need, gave donations to elder shelters, and withdrew from public life. The world outside my home grew brighter, even as the world inside grew simpler. My son sent letters, some apologetic, some bitter. I didn't respond, not out of cruelty, but because silence was now my boundary. Some wounds don't heal through words, they heal through distance. Months passed. The house became lighter, the air softer. My health improved, my sleep returned. The burden that had once bent my back was gone. I had traded pain for peace, and it was a fair exchange. Every morning, when I brewed my tea, I smiled faintly. The steam rising from the cup reminded me that even bitterness can dissolve if you let it. I sometimes wonder if my son truly understood the lesson. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But that's no longer my concern. I taught him one final truth. When you poison love with cruelty, the antidote isn't mercy, it's consequence. The court order had done its work. The bank accounts remained frozen. His influence, once loud and intimidating, vanished into silence. People who had once flattered him now avoided his name. And I found peace not in his downfall, but in my own freedom. I had reclaimed my dignity, sip by sip, like tea made fresh after years of being served cold. The man who once spat in my cup was now drinking the bitterness he had brewed himself. Justice had been served, and it was clean. After the storm had passed, life slowed down, the kind of stillness that feels like a quiet exhale after years of holding your breath. I moved out of the big house that had seen too much shouting, too much pride, too many ghosts. I sold it without hesitation. Every brick held a memory, and every memory was heavy. I wanted lightness now. I found a small cottage by the sea, far from the noise, far from the past. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. The air smelled of salt and rain. The mornings were soft, painted in gold. The waves rolled endlessly, as if whispering forgiveness from the horizon. Here, no one called me old or useless. The fishermen waved when I walked by. Children smiled when I handed them sweets. Respect came not from fear or money, but from kindness freely given. Each morning, I brewed my tea by the window, the same way I always had. But now the cup tasted different, warm, calm, untouched by insult. The bitterness that once lingered had finally lifted. I realized that peace doesn't come from punishing someone else. It comes from freeing yourself from what broke you. I spent my days tending to a small garden behind the cottage. Flowers, herbs, and a single lemon tree stood proudly in the sun. I often thought about how the soil responds to care. Water it with patience, and it gives back more than you expect. People are no different. I had spent years watering a relationship that refused to grow. Here, for the first time, I saw things bloom again. In the afternoons, I walked along the shoreline collecting small shells. Each one felt like a reminder. Fragile, beautiful, once tossed by storms but now resting in peace. Sometimes, I met other elders from nearby towns. We shared stories, laughter, and quiet understanding. None of them cared who I had been or what wealth I had lost. They saw the man I had become, steady, simple, content. One of them once said, "You look lighter, my friend." I smiled, because I finally put down the weight that wasn't mine to carry. It was true. I had carried guilt, anger, disappointment, and heartbreak for years. My son had tried to turn me into a man who begged for love, who accepted disrespect as a price of family. But the day I walked away, I didn't just reclaim my property. I reclaimed myself. Every letter he sent went unread. I kept them all in a box, tucked away in the bottom drawer. Forgiveness doesn't always need a reply. Sometimes silence is the kindest answer. I didn't hate him. I simply accepted that he had to live with what he had done. I hoped he would learn, not from punishment, but from absence. Some lessons echo louder in emptiness. In the evenings I sat outside, watching the sunset paint the sea in shades of fire and rose. The waves carried their rhythm, gentle, endless, honest. The sky changed, but the sea never stopped. I admired that. It reminded me that peace isn't the absence of pain. It's the persistence to keep moving, despite it. I spent my time reading again, something I hadn't done in years. Books became companions, soft voices in quiet rooms. I read stories of men who lost everything and still found grace. I realized I had become one of them. My wealth was no longer in money or name. It was in peace, in mornings without arguments, in nights without noise. Sometimes I caught myself wondering about my son, where he was, how he lived, whether he had changed. But the thought didn't hurt anymore. I wished him well from afar. Life has a way of teaching lessons in circles. What we give, we get back, eventually. I had given him arrogance once, by never saying no. Now, the world would give him humility. I grew old quietly. My hands trembled, but my heart didn't. Every day felt earned. Every breath was calm. The sea outside my window was both a mirror and a friend. I had left behind pain, revenge, and noise. In return, I gained something no man could steal. Peace that didn't depend on anyone else's apology. I realized something simple one morning, as the sun rose over the waves. Dignity is not given by others. It's protected by the choices we make when others stop respecting us. I had chosen peace over pain, silence over shouting, tea over poison. And in that silence, I found my life again. When people asked me later how I could walk away so completely, I would only say one thing: because peace was waiting for me. I just had to stop arguing with the noise. Now, in the quiet stretch of my final years, I often find myself sitting by the window, staring at the sea that never stops moving. It reminds me of life, always in motion, never truly still, no matter how much loss or peace it carries. The waves rise and fall, just like love and disappointment, just like anger and forgiveness. I have learned that the tides of emotion are meant to move, not drown us. Sometimes I think back to the day my son spat in my tea. It feels like a lifetime ago, like it happened to another man entirely. For a long time, that moment defined me. The humiliation, the betrayal, the ache that followed. But now, it feels like a chapter, not the whole book. I no longer replay the insult. I remember the lesson instead. Pain doesn't destroy you. It sharpens you if you let it. I used to believe revenge was the only closure, but the truth is quieter, deeper. It isn't about destroying someone else's peace. It's about building your own. What I did wasn't out of hatred. It was out of self-respect. I didn't ruin my son's life. I returned him to the one he created for himself. When a man plants cruelty, he shouldn't be surprised when it grows faster than kindness. My days are slow now, but not empty. I wake up before sunrise, brew my tea, and let the warmth remind me that some things, dignity, patience, peace, are worth keeping hot. The first sip always brings calm, and in that calm, I find strength. I used to think old age was about waiting for the end. Now I know it's about witnessing what time repairs and what it doesn't. I often think about forgiveness. People expect it to be grand, spoken, dramatic. But for me, forgiveness is a quiet thing. It's choosing not to carry bitterness when you could. It's sipping your tea and not tasting the past in it anymore. I don't hate my son. I hope he finds his way. But whether he does or doesn't is no longer my burden. Some bridges burn for warmth, and that's enough. When I walk through the village, people sometimes ask about my family. I smile and say, they taught me everything I needed to learn. It's true, not through kindness, but through cruelty. Because pain, when survived, becomes wisdom. It teaches you what to protect, what to release, and who to stop waiting for. At night, when the sea glows under the moon, I write small notes in a worn journal. Thoughts, memories, quiet lessons. Not for anyone else to read, just for me to remember who I became after the storm. I write things like, respect isn't inherited, it's earned, and peace doesn't shout, it just stays. Each line feels like closing another door softly, without regret. I've realized something about love, too. Real love doesn't hurt. Attachment does. I was attached to an idea that family means loyalty, that blood guarantees respect. But the truth is, family isn't who shares your name. It's who shares your values. I lost a son by blood, but I gained peace by choice. That trade, though painful, saved my life. Some evenings I see young men arguing with their fathers in the market, voices sharp, full of pride. I want to stop them, to say, be careful. Words can turn a home into a courtroom, but I stay silent. Each man must learn his own truth. I can only hope they learn before they lose what can't be replaced. As the years pass, I find joy in the smallest things. The sound of the kettle, the sea breeze against my face, the chirping of birds outside my window. These are the sounds of freedom. These are the songs that come when you stop trying to fix what was never yours to fix. I've outlived my anger. That's the best revenge time can give. I have no desire to explain my story to those who weren't there. The truth doesn't need witnesses. It lives quietly in the peace that follows justice. Before I sleep, I always pour one last cup of tea. The same drink that once carried my humiliation now carries my peace. I take a slow sip and whisper to myself, he spat in my tea, but I served him justice instead. Then I smile, because that's the beauty of life. The same cup that once broke, you can one day heal you. And if I could leave one thought behind for anyone who hears my story, it would be this. Never beg for respect. Never trade your peace for someone else's pride. Walk away, rebuild quietly, and let your calm be the echo they never forget. Because in the end, silence doesn't mean defeat. Sometimes silence is simply the sound of dignity winning.